Guild Wars 2's Necromancer, an absolute Goliath when it comes to PvE, endgame content, PvP and world versus world. The class has so much flexibility in its elite specializations, but even in its core build, it shines extremely well in most content. With incredible burst, survivability and also use of shroud skills, it has so much utility to offer to any group or even solo play. Without further ado, let's pick this apart and see why it's just so damn good. So just like with my last two guides, the point of the guide series is to look at incredibly strong endgame PvE builds and then either look at amazing core like open world builds that are just so dominated, or also these builds are incredibly good for leveling all the way into the expansions to unlock those elite specializations. But these builds by themselves are so strong you won't really need the elite specialization because they're so well rounded and survivable. Now let's have a look at our gear and stats. For gear, there is basically three main ways we can go. The way this build is currently, it's all Berserker's pieces. And there's another way that you can build if you want to go into Reaper, where we'll switch one or two pieces to Assassins. And then there's another build that will basically make this as efficient as possible. So if you're only going to use this build and you're not going to transition to Reaper, have a look at that. I will link all three builds in the description below and try to mark them as accurately as possible. So build how you want to. For the current build that I'm using, it's all Berserker's pieces, and you can either use Rune of the Dragon Hunter or Rune of the Scholar, just depending on what you can get your hands on. For Relic, we will use Relic of the Thief, but you may use any Relic, depending on what content you enjoy doing. If you want more survivability, switch it out as need be, but Relic of the Thief is good DPS. Now for Sigils, we will use Sigil of Force, and then we'll either use Sigil of Accuracy. Now this is the build that will transition better into Reaper, or we'll use Sigil of Impact, and that is going to be better for your open world, and also kind of if you are going to take this core Reaper into like things like fractals and things like that, that will be pretty much the best way to do it. Now I more recommend going, obviously if you are going to go into fractals, to go into Reaper, but if you are a free-to-play player and you want to stay free-to-play, then obviously you can build this. And what we'll do is we'll play around with our crit chance. Generally, in this build, if your crit chance is 75%, that's perfectly crit capped. So that basically means with our 25% from Fury, we'll be at 100%. But if you are going to build to Reaper, you might want to push your crit chance up because our crit chance will drop substantially when we switch over to Reaper. So we'll be under crit cap currently. Now when it comes to weapons, I will be the bearer of bad news. There is basically almost infinite choices in weapons. If you have the expansions, using a greatsword, ridiculously good. Even if you don't have the expansions, Axe Focus is ridiculously strong. And then I like to use a Dagger Warhorn, but you can pretty much put absolutely anything. A lot of builds recommend Dagger. A lot of builds recommend Axe Torch. There is an infinite choice. So the only weapons that I would kind of eliminate based on the fact that we are building power is I would eliminate the scepter and I would eliminate the torch slightly because those are slightly more confusion focused. But anything else, focus, warhorn or dagger offhand is fairly good. Even the staff is ridiculously strong. So if you do want a bit more range to your build and you don't want just the range from axe, staff is ridiculously strong, especially if you are mob tapping. So basically the way the build will work is I would suggest as leveling, see what you enjoy playing with and basically just lock into those weapons. The reason why we like the axe is the axe has its 900 range, and the reason why we like the focus is the focus has 3 charges of quite strong healing as well as a nice boon corruption. And the reason why that we like the dagger is the auto attack is the best life force generation in game. This will basically cap up your life force in seconds. You've got a very strong heal as well as a nice boon corruption and self bleed, which comes into play in a lot of our skills. Then if you do take the Warhorn has a very strong fear, which is a good CC skill, and a very nice damaging and party-wide lifesteal, which is quite strong. However, a lot of builds do recommend taking the Dagger vibe, and why this is great is this transfers conditions to enemies as well as has quite a nice AoE bleed. Also, hey, I'm streaming on Twitch, link above me and one in the description below. It would be awesome to see you there. And without further ado, let's have a look at your traits and specializations. Your first specialization, Spite. Minor trait 1, Reaper's Might. Your Shroud 1 skill grants might. Now this is your auto attack. Ridiculously strong. Like, let's just put it this way. This is going to be incredible might generation, especially the fact that it's a 15-second duration. You can spam it, get some good might uptime, and do big damage. Now in column 1, we have a few good options. Spiteful Talisman, just ridiculously strong. 10% flat damage, and we have extra recharge on axe and focus skills, 20%. Now this is also a reason why I like to put my axe and focus on the same weapon set, is that I can basically just time these rotations as if they were normally done. Now your second option, Spiteful Renewal, it's not horrible. Basically we have a 5-second cooldown internally on the skill, but it's linked to our healing skill. So when we use our healing skill, we remove an extra condition. Now this is okay, but I don't really see it being something very great. Bitter Chill, this could be pretty good. Chills basically inflict extra vulnerability. Now the reason why this is good, especially on open world, vulnerabilities, incoming damage, and more damage on the target. So if we can get more vulnerability, we increase our DPS substantially. So sometimes that might outweigh this, depending on what our vulnerability uptime is like. But generally with Necro, our vulnerability is fairly good because we get a lot of it through our skills. So that's why I would rather go for Spiteful Talisman over this. But have a look at it in your own gameplay. Now Minor Trait 2, Death's Embrace, a very simple skill. We do extra damage, 25% when we're in down state. And also if we hit a target when it's below 50% health, we'll give it 5 stacks of vulnerability. Now that's an 8-second duration with a 10-second internal cooldown. So that's a fairly good amount. It's like 80% uptime, and 5 stacks of vulnerability is pretty good. This will just happen passively. You won't have to actually think about this. Now in column 2, there are a few good options to have a look at. Chill of Death, this will basically cast your Lesser Spinal Shivers, which is your focus skill, when you attack a target below 50% health. Basically it's a good boon strip at about 50%. Now the reason why this isn't as good is because I don't like skills that we can't really time. So yeah, when it just goes off, I mean the target might not have boons and it might just do a bit of damage. It's not the greatest skill. Number 2, Awaken the Pain. This is ridiculously good because what this does is it gives us extra power rather than condition damage. Because we are predominantly power focused, this is just going to make us hit like an absolute train when we have stacks of might, and we are going to have a fair amount of might. So yeah, incredibly strong. The third option is not too bad. Signets of Suffering. When you use the Signet, it will remove 2 boons. So if there are fights where the target we're attacking will gain a lot of boons, sometimes using certain things like your Signet of Spite or whatever, and then having this skill allows it to do some good boon ripping. So yeah, just a way to basically help us with our boon rip if we are struggling with that. And then Minor Trait 3, Siphon Power. We gain 3 stacks of might when we attack a target below 50% health, and that's on a 1-second recharge. So yeah, incredibly strong. Basically from 50% to dead, we're pretty much going to have 25 stacks of might because there's no way you're not getting the utility out of the skill, making it ridiculously good. And now in column 3, we have a fair bit of options again. I like Dread, and let's not mince words, this is a ridiculously good skill. When we fear a target, we get boons. And Quickness, having that on open world, ridiculously strong, and Fury obviously going to help us crit cap and therefore do massive damage. Also our Shard skill 3 will recharge by 50% when we kill a target. So yes, this is incredibly strong because if you are using the Warhorn, you will have a fear. You will have a fear if you are using the staff with a fairly short cooldown, mind you, and also your Shard skill 3 is a fear, making this quite good. We could stack up quite a lot of quickness and fury with the skill, making it ridiculously strong. Now obviously Close to Death, also just so good. We're doing 20% extra damage to the last 50% of a target. So if you are especially fighting a boss, it's nice to have these passive abilities so that you know you're just getting the utility, doing big damage, and not having to think about, you know, timing your fears and things like that. And then obviously Spiteful Spirit. This is also a very strong ability. especially in AoE and especially if you're doing certain, say, fractals where there are a lot of adds that have boons. What this does is it basically casts Spiteful Spirit, the skill, which is a massive AoE hit, giving yourself resolution and also removing 2 boons and additional 2 boons if the targets are below 50% health. So when you enter Shroud, the skill procs, and it is just so strong if there is that case for boon removal. It's so hard to say, yes, take this exact specialization, because there are so many options where you might want to play around with certain traits to get better utility out of your skills and your gameplay style. Now for our next specialization, Soul Reaping. Minor trait 1, Gluttony. All skills that produce life force produce 10% more. So this just helps us get life force quicker so that we can get and do more in Shroud. Now in the first column, it's not simple. Just like everything in Necromancer, everything is a trade-off and an option. Unyielding Blast basically allows our Shroud skill 1 to inflict vulnerability, and it's just such good utility because remember, our Shroud skill 1 is already producing might, so just auto attacking in Shroud is going to give us might and vulnerability, so we can basically cap up might and vulnerability incredibly strong. However, Soul Marks is a very good option as well if you are using a staff. What this does is it allows all these skills, which you can see are marked as mark skills, to basically be unblockable and also generate 3% life force when they trigger. So yes, we get in a ton of utility as well as life force from using a staff. So yeah, if you are using a staff, Soul Marks is a very strong contender because this will help us with our life force generation. And then the last skill, Speed of Shadows, what this does is it allows us to get swiftness as well as lose all movement impairing effects when entering Shroud. So that is very strong for survivability options. Sometimes you're in fights where there's a lot of soft CCs like cripples and mobs, and it's really nice to have this to just shake off and not die. Minor trait 2, Sinister Shroud. Shroud skills gain 15% reduced recharge timing. That's really nice for us because that basically just allows us to get more utility out of these massive hitting skills. And again, column 2 is not simple. Like, I'm going to put it out there. It's just not a simple way to look. Soul Barbs is the way you go for most damage. What this does is when entering and exiting Shroud, you'll get 15 seconds of increased damage by 10%. Now that is really good for damage dealing, and that's why it's generally recommended. And most traits, whether you're playing Scourge or Repo, something like this, Soul Barbs is generally taken because of that damage burst. But for survivability, Vital Persistence, really strong. 180 Vitality as well as 20% incoming healing. Now this is good for survivability. And notice also that increased Vitality increases our life force. So having the extra Vitality will affect our life force, meaning that we can use more skills and stay in Shroud for longer. And then another good choice, Fear of Death. What this does is when we use fear effects, we gain life force. As well, fear effects are increased by 100%. So you'll notice, say in the case of Doom, our Shroud skill 3, that is 2 seconds. If we activate this, it will move up to 4 seconds, making it incredibly strong for CC as a fear effect in general. And especially if we are going to play around with skills like Dread, increasing and getting quickness and fury, playing around fears is not the worst thing in the world. And then minor trait 3, Soul Battery, our maximum life force is increased by 20%. Again, just giving us more life force so that we can stay in Shroud and use more skills. Now column 3 makes things slightly simpler. We have Eternal Life. What this does is this will give us increased life force generation when we're not in Shroud, and we'll gain protection when we go into Shroud. But that is only 3 seconds. This is basically not the greatest way to generate life force, and especially because we have Dagger, we don't really require this, and 3 seconds of protection is not enough to justify taking this. And then a skill that makes it easy for us, Death Perception. We basically get increased crit chance flat 15%, and then we get increased crit damage when in Shroud. So yeah, just incredible strong damage, and the crit chance just makes us do bigger damage overall, so making it pretty much a no-brainer. Doomfire is a fairly decent skill if you are going into Condi, but we're not playing Condi, so this is kind of something we'll not really consider for ourselves. And then for our next specialization, we go into Curses. Our first minor trait, Barb Precision. When we crit, we have a 33% chance to give some bleeding, and bleeding duration is increased. Now this is just free DPS, so we're never going to be angry about it. We're going to take it and be very happy. Now column 1 is slightly easier for us. Insidious Disruption. When we disable a foe, we put Torment on them. We're not really Condi focused, so this is okay, but not great. Plague Sending, incredibly strong. Now most Condi builds also work on Plague Sending. When entering Shroud, we transfer 2 conditions on ourselves to the enemy. Now this works well with certain skills that produce self-bleed, things like this, or if you're in a fight where the target is putting Condis on you. When you go into Shroud, it will send 2 conditions to the enemy, and that is incredibly strong for DPS, even for ourselves. And then the last choice, Chill in Darkness. Blinding the target also produces a chill, and this can be fairly good if you use skills like Bitter Chill to try get some extra vulnerability. So yeah, not a terrible option, but Plague Sending still just incredibly strong. Minor trait 2, Furious Demise. We're getting Fury 8 seconds when going into Shroud, as well as getting a flat 180 precision. That's just basically more crit chance. And as a side note, this is why we undercap when we go into Reaper, because we don't take curses. So this is where the extra differential comes in terms of our crit cap. Now column 2 is again simpler for us. Master of Corruption, incredibly strong, but this relies on mostly condition damage, ability, utilities. So we're not really going to take this because we're not going to use any of these skills in general. However, Path of Corruption is so strong. Shroud skill 2 converts an additional 2 boons into conditions, making this a good boon converter. What's nice about these boon conversions in general is they're not just ripping boons off of the target you're fighting, but they're making them into Condis, just helping you do more DPS in general. And then the final choice in column 2, Parasitic Contagion. This allows you to heal 5% of condition damage you do. Now, unfortunately for us, we're not doing much condition damage. You can consider this for some of the healing from Barb Precision and other skills like that, but we don't have that many Condis, and we're not doing that much damage to get a lot of utility out of this skill. And now Minor Trait 3, Target the Weak. What this does is allows you to get an extra 2% crit chance for every condition on the enemy. Now this is kind of the hidden Hail Mary, and why we don't really care too much about not having Fury for the full uptime, because a lot of our skills do actually have conditions attached to them, meaning we will get some passive extra crit chance on target, making this minor trait ridiculously strong, especially for us in open world. We're not going to have perfect boon uptime, so yes, having extra crit chance means we'll be able to do big damage really consistently. Then as a side note on the skill, we gain extra condition damage based on our precision, and generally because we are mostly berserkers pieces with quite high precision, that means we'll have a decent amount of condition damage helping us with certain skills. And on column 3 we have 2 really strong options. Generally most people recommend Weakening Shroud. What this means is when we enter Shroud we cast Lesser Enfeeble. This is a good 5 target AoE hit. So we're doing a bit of damage, a bit of bleed, weakness, as well as it's unblockable. So this is a nice AoE hit when entering Shroud. So we get that every 10 seconds, and yeah, just having a good time. But I would highly recommend Terror if you are going to play for more of the Fear build, where you're using Dread, you're using Fear of Death. I would go for Terror, because what this does is when we cast Fear effects, we will basically give damage and not just Fear. That means that when we use skills like Shroud skill 3 Doom, as well as Warhorn skill 4 Wail of Doom, we'll be doing extra damage, incredibly strong. And then the last skill, Lingering Curse. This basically is if you're using a Scepter, increasing the duration of Condis from Scepter. Very, very strong if you are playing a Condi build, but for us we're predominantly power, so we're not looking at this right now. Now I do want to give a slight honorable mention to Blood Magic. Now this can be quite good for more survivability or group kind of utility survivability. Now there's strong things like Vampiric Presence, almost like a lifesteal aura that you give to your party. You've got things like Lesser Well of Blood. What this does is helps revive targets when you revive them. So when you push F on your down friends, it will cast this skill on top of them. And obviously Transfusion. When using Shroud skill 4, it will basically pull allies towards you, and you can raise them out of danger. So sometimes people might go downstate in some dangerous mechanics, this is an incredible way to pull them out of danger. Obviously, you can play around with blood magic, and it is very, very good for supportive skills. Even sometimes if you just want vampiric presence for yourself, you can play around to try and get some more DPS out of this trait tree. But yes, incredibly strong. So if I had to recommend anything, I would say go for Spite first, because we're going to get incredible might generation as well as partial vulnerability, making this incredibly strong for your self-booning. Then afterwards, I'm going to self-repin, helping us get incredible life force generation as well as extra vulnerability, making this so strong when you start to transition into better gear. Then I would go to curses for some decent damage as well as utility and survivability. Now let's have a look at our utilities and skills. For healing skills, I enjoy the Blood Fiend. What this will do is it will summon the Blood Fiend. When the Blood Fiend attacks, it will heal you in periodic portions, making it quite decent for passive healing. When used active, it will sacrifice the Blood Fiend, giving you a fairly large heal. Pretty much all the heals are viable to some degree. Sigil of Vampirism, good for some passive healing and decent when used active. So that means that the Sigil of Vampirism is kind of like the Blood Fiend, but slightly more melee focused. Well of Blood, incredibly strong heal that is nice for party-wide heals as well as a good source of regeneration. And then Consume Conditions. This is what a lot of people do recommend because it is pretty much one of the biggest heals. And then also we'll do extra healing based on the amount of conditions consumed. But the downside is obviously you will get some vulnerability, but we can always send those vulnerability stacks over to a target or cleanse them with some of our other utility skills. Now, for utilities, it is always such a tough task to go through all of the Necromancer ones because I feel like Necromancer has the best utilities out of any class. Now, I do like a Spectral Armor. What this does is for 8 seconds we'll gain protection, and this is also a stun break, making it really strong. But for those 8 seconds, all damage we take will give us life force. So that is another strong way to gain life force so that we can go into Shroud. Then for other utility skills, Well of Suffering and Well of Darkness are two massive hitting skills. 6 hits inflicting vulnerability for Suffering, and for Darkness, Blind and Chill. They're big AoE 5 targets, and they last 5 and 6 seconds respectively with combo dark fields. They're basically just big damage as well as producing us some extra conditions on the target, making them ridiculously strong. However, like I said before, the Necromancer is probably one of the most best classes. We have a CPC. This is your projectile destruction. Really strong for most content. Epidemic, basically taking the conditions from one target and spreading it onto 5 other targets. Really strong skill, and yeah, just something to be aware of. Spectral Grasp is pretty much one of the best pulls in the game. This will pull 5 targets, but if you use the skill inside of a large hitbox, you can get all 5 of these hands to grab onto the same target, doing incredible break bar damage and pretty much destroying CC bars. As well, all these signets are fairly strong, especially Spite if you just want some passive power. They all have passive abilities with really strong actives, making them incredibly strong. If not, and you are one of those players that perhaps struggles a slight bit, having minions is pretty much one of the safest ways to play. Having the minions, pulling them all out and just allowing them to do DPS, they scale based on your level, meaning that even if you are undergeared or performing fairly weak, they will do incredible damage and also just help you dominate on the open world. They all have active abilities, like in the case of the Bone Minions, they'll explode, as well as the Shadow Fiend doing some nice damage as well as some soft CCs. They have incredibly interesting effects, especially like the Flesh Worm. You can place this 1200 range away from you. It will do some poison damage, and when you use the skill active a second time, it will basically teleport you to where the worm was and kill it. And then 2 other incredibly strong skills to be aware of. Well of Corruption. This is an incredible ability when you want to keep on corrupting boons. For 5 seconds, this well will pulse, converting boons on enemies into conditions. So if there is a case in certain fights where an enemy is just continuously generating their own boons, this is a way to absolutely shred that. And then Well of Power. This does the opposite effect. This converts conditions into boons as well as granting might. So if there is certain fights where you're basically just continuously getting conditions on yourself, you can turn those into positives by using this. Incredibly strong, and the fact that it is 5 target makes it a great team-wide utility skill. Now for our elite utilities, a lot of times people will leave on the Flesh Golem. The Flesh Golem is incredibly strong and has probably one of the highest CCs in game. It's much more than the 332 that it claims to be, and it could be higher depending on the fight. So incredible CC as well as just some nice passive damage from the Golem itself. However, if you do want massive burst, Lich Form is a very, very nice skill. What this does is it transforms you into a Lich with massive vitality and precision gains and allows you to do big damage and also big survivability. Then for your third option, Plague Lance. Plague Lance is incredibly strong if you are playing a condition damage variant. This is taken a lot of times by Harbingers and Scourges and things like this that want to gain all those beautiful strong conditions. But for us, you'll probably end up looking at the Flesh Golem for sustained damage and the Lich Form for extremely strong burst damage. Now, if I had to suggest a way for a newer player while leveling, I would go fully into minion first. Allowing these minions to be around you, they'll scale to your level, making them incredibly strong regardless of what your stats are. And this will just help you eat through the leveling process and your open world experience. Then I would go into well training. A lot of these wells, like the Well of Suffering as well as the Well of Darkness, are incredibly strong, high damage builds that, yeah, you're going to get a lot of utility out of. And then afterwards, I would look into Signet training. This will basically just allow you to get some nice passive abilities that you don't have to think very much of, especially like the Signet of Spite. Allowing you to get passive power is very strong. And then afterwards, it's up to you whether you want to go for Spectral or Corruption. And that's it. That's the guide. I really hope that this guide has found you well. I hope that you enjoy playing Necro out in open world and whatever content you love yourself doing. I love playing Necro, probably one of my favorite classes to play, and I hope this helps you enjoy Necro even more. If you did enjoy the video, please give it a like and a subscribe. It always helps the channel grow. And if you didn't enjoy the video, thank you so much for watching anyway. And I'll hopefully see you guys in the next one. Cheers.